My name is Soleil, and I was 31 years old when my two aunts held a family meeting at my grandmother's kitchen table and decided, without inviting me, that my visits were making her worse. That was the phrase they used when my cousin texted me afterward. Not that I had done anything specific. Not that there had been an incident. Just that my visits were, quote, confusing for her, and we think it's better if you step back for a while. I drove to the end of my street and parked. I sat there for a few minutes. I thought about the last time I had seen my grandmother, 4 days earlier, a Wednesday afternoon, the two of us at her kitchen table with the window open and the radio on low the way she always kept it, and she had been telling me, clearly and in full sentences, about the summer she was 17 and worked at a cannery in Central California and saved enough to buy her first winter coat. She had not been confused. She had been completely herself. There was something else I was thinking about, sitting in my car at the end of that street. Something my grandmother had said to me about 8 months earlier, in a different conversation, in that same kitchen. She had mentioned her attorney. She had mentioned that she had been meaning to update some paperwork. She had looked at me in a particular way when she said it, not pointed, just steady, and then she had changed the subject. I did not know yet what that paperwork was going to do. Within 6 months, I would understand exactly. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork speak first. If you're new here, hit subscribe, new stories every week, and the comments are full of people who know exactly what it feels like to be voted out of a room that should have always had your name on the door. My grandmother's name is Celestine. She is 78 years old, and she has lived in the same house in the same neighborhood in the Central Valley for 41 years. It is a corner house on a street of mature sycamores, the kind of trees that drop their bark in long papery curls every summer and make the sidewalk look like something is always in the middle of shedding. The house is yellow, not a bright yellow, but the particular faded yellow of something that was painted with intention a long time ago and has settled into its own shade over the decades. There is a vegetable garden along the south side that my grandmother has maintained since before I was born. Tomatoes in summer, winter squash in fall. A row of herbs along the fence that she uses and also gives away to the neighbors in small paper bags. She folds herself. I want to describe her accurately, because she matters to this story in a way that is not symbolic or decorative, but completely specific. Celestine is a woman who raised 4 children in that house after my grandfather died young. He had a cardiac event at 52 and she was 43, and she did not sell the house, did not move in with her own mother, did not do any of the things that people might have done. She stayed. She went back to work full-time at the county assessor's office, where she had been working part-time for 6 years, and she stayed there for another 19 years before she retired, and she raised her 4 children to adulthood on a government salary and a small survivor benefit and the careful management of a household where nothing was wasted and everything was maintained. She is sharp. She reads 2 newspapers, 1 print and 1 digital, and she has opinions about both. She does crosswords in pen. She grows her own food. She drives herself to the grocery store and the pharmacy and to her hair appointment every 4 weeks, which she has had on the same schedule at the same salon for 23 years. She has macular degeneration in her left eye that requires monitoring, but has not materially changed how she moves through the world. She is not confused. She has never been confused. That is important. My mother is Celestine's youngest child. She passed away 6 years ago from a sudden aneurysm. There was no warning, no decline, no long goodbye. She was there, and then she wasn't, and the loss reorganized everything in our family the way sudden losses do, which is to say incompletely and permanently. My grandmother grieved in the way she does most things, steadily, without public display, and with continued attention to the vegetable garden and the crossword and the Wednesday afternoon radio program she has listened to since my mother was a teenager. I am my mother's only child. My father was not in the picture, a fact that was never dramatized in our family, simply stated as a condition of things. Which meant that when my mother died, the family I had left was my grandmother and my grandmother's other 3 children, my aunts Pauline and Dorothea, and my uncle Terence, who lives in another state and was not, as far as I could tell, involved in anything that happened in the period I'm going to describe. Pauline is 61. She is organized, opinionated, and has been the de facto family coordinator for as long as I can remember, the one who arranges holiday logistics, who forwards medical information to the group text, who believes, with some genuine sincerity, that being the oldest means being responsible. I do not think Pauline is a bad person. I want to say that clearly, because the story I am telling could make her sound like one, and the truth is more complicated than that. Pauline loves my grandmother. She also has a very specific idea of what loving someone looks like, and that idea does not always leave room for how the person themselves might want to be loved. Dorothea is 58. She is quieter than Pauline, but deferential to her in a pattern that has been in place since childhood, and that I do not think either of them has ever examined very carefully. Where Pauline leads, Dorothea follows, usually a sentence or two behind, adding agreement or elaboration. When the two of them are in the same room with a shared position, they function as a single voice. I am a landscape draftswoman. I work for a small civil planning firm in the same metro area as my grandmother, drawing site plans and grading documents for residential and light commercial projects. It is precise, detailed work that requires patience and an eye for the thing that is slightly off before it becomes a problem. I have been told I am good at it. I make a modest salary. I rent a one-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from my grandmother's house, which is not an accident. I chose that apartment specifically because of the distance, 2 years after my mother died, when I understood that proximity to Celestine was something I needed to protect. I visited my grandmother every Wednesday afternoon. This was not a formal arrangement. It had evolved organically over the 2 years since I'd moved close, and it had simply become the rhythm of our week. I would arrive around 2 o'clock. She would have the radio on, a classical program that ran from 1 to 4. I would make tea, or she would have already made it. We would sit at the kitchen table with the window open if the weather allowed, which in the Central Valley means most of the year, and we would talk. She would tell me things. Stories from her childhood in Central California, her years at the cannery, the summer she met my grandfather at a dance in Fresno, the early years of the marriage, the children being born, the texture of a life lived in one place over a long span of time. I recorded some of those conversations with her knowledge and her interest. She liked the idea that they existed somewhere, that someone had wanted to keep them. I have a folder on my laptop of maybe 40 hours of audio, organized by year and topic. That folder matters to this story in a way I did not anticipate when I started it. The neighbor who becomes important in what follows is a woman named Harriet Soleil. Harriet is 64 years old and has lived next door to Celestine for 17 years. She is a retired school librarian, which I mention because it is relevant to her character in the way that certain professions are. She is precise about facts, careful about sources, and constitutionally opposed to the substitution of assumption for evidence. She and my grandmother share a low fence along the property line, a gate in that fence that neither of them locks, and a long history of borrowing things and returning them and watching out for each other in the quiet accumulating way of neighbors who have decided, without ever discussing it, that they're on the same side. Harriet had a key to my grandmother's house. This was a practical arrangement that had been in place for years, for the times my grandmother traveled, for emergencies, for the ordinary contingencies of an older woman living alone. Pauline knew about the key. She had, at some point in the past, expressed mild disapproval of it, on the grounds that it was a liability, and my grandmother had told her that Harriet was more reliable than any liability it might create, and that had been the end of the conversation, as far as my grandmother was concerned. I want to also tell you about the attorney because she becomes important, and her role makes more sense if you understand how long she had been in my grandmother's life. Her name is Ms. Audra Fontaine. She is a solo practice estate attorney who has had an office 3 blocks from the county courthouse for 31 years. She drafted my grandparents' wills in the early 1990s. She handled the probate process when my grandfather died. She updated my grandmother's documents after my mother passed. She is not glamorous or imposing. She is a small, precise woman who keeps meticulous files and returns phone calls within 24 hours and who has, over 30 years of working with Celestine, developed the particular professional familiarity that comes from seeing someone through multiple chapters of a life. My grandmother trusted her completely. This trust was not sentimental. It was the trust of someone who had watched a professional do their job correctly across 3 decades and had no reason to update the assessment. These are the components. This is the landscape. What happened next was constructed from these specific materials, in this specific place, by people who understood exactly what they were doing and people who thought they did. The first sign came on a Saturday morning in early March about 20 months ago. I had not been to my grandmother's house since the previous Wednesday, which was normal. I was at home when my cousin Bryce, Pauline's younger son, who is generally neutral in family matters in the way that people who live close to the center of things learn to be neutral as a survival strategy, sent me a text that said, "Hey, just so you know, Mom had a family meeting this morning at Grandma's. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. She said it went fine. Just wanted you to know it happened." I texted back, "What was the meeting about?" He said, "Grandma's care plan. I don't have details." I said, "Was I supposed to be there?" He said, "I assumed you knew about it.
Sorry."
I set my phone down on the kitchen counter. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up and called Pauline. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was the voice she uses when she has already prepared what she is going to say, which is a particular kind of smoothness, not warm exactly, but managed. She said, "Soleil, I'm glad you called. We've been talking as a family about Grandma's situation, and we wanted to get aligned before we brought it to her." I said, "What situation?" She said, "She's 78. She's living alone. The macular degeneration is progressing. We think it's time to start talking about a more structured care environment." I said, "She drives herself everywhere. She gardens. She does the crossword in pen." Pauline said, "Soleil, I know you're close to her, and that's wonderful, but we need to be realistic. We're her children. We have a different kind of responsibility here." I said, "I understand that, but she's not confused or incapable. Pauline said, "We've also been talking about the visits." There was a brief pause, not long, but deliberate. "We think the frequency might be a little much for her. She's mentioned feeling tired after your Wednesdays." I said, "She's mentioned that to you?" Pauline said, "We've had conversations with her, yes." I said, "Has she said she wants me to come less?" Pauline said, "It's not about what she wants, Soleil. It's about what's best for her routine and her rest. We think stepping back a little would help with that." I stayed on the line for a moment. There was something at the base of my throat that had gone very tight. I said, carefully, "I'd like to talk to her myself about this." Pauline said, "Of course, but maybe give it a few days. Let her settle after this morning." I said, "What happened this morning?" Pauline said, "Just a family conversation. Nothing alarming. We talked about some care options, some changes to the routine. She was tired afterward, which is exactly what I mean." I said, "Was she told I was being asked to step back?" Pauline said, "We framed it as a coordinated approach. Soleil, I know this is hard, but you're her granddaughter, not her caregiver. There's a distinction there."
She said it gently.
That was the most disorienting thing about Pauline. She was always gentle. Everything she said arrived wrapped in the tone of a person who was being reasonable and patient with someone who was having difficulty understanding something straightforward. I said, "I'll call her in a few days." And I ended the call. I did not call my grandmother in a few days. I called her the next morning. She answered on the third ring and sounded exactly like herself, clear, present, slightly amused that I was calling on a Sunday because I usually called on Wednesdays. I said I'd heard there had been a family meeting. She said, yes, her daughters had come over with some literature about assisted living communities. She said the word literature with a specific dryness that I recognized as her way of indicating she found something faintly absurd. She said they had talked for 2 hours and she had made them lunch, and by the end she had a folder of brochures that she had put on the shelf above the washing machine. I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm fine, Soleil. I've been managing my own life for a long time." I said, "They said you were tired after." She said, "I'm always tired after 2 hours with Pauline. That's not new." I laughed. She laughed. We talked for 20 minutes about the garden and a book she was reading and nothing else. I thought that was the end of it. It was not. The following Wednesday, I arrived at my grandmother's house at 2 o'clock as usual. I knocked. I always knocked, even though she expected me and no one answered. I knocked again. I heard the radio inside, the classical program, which meant she was home. I knocked a third time, and then I called her cell phone. And after 4 rings, she answered and said, with a quality in her voice that was different from her usual ease, "Soleil, I'm so sorry. Pauline told me she was going to call you. Today isn't a good day." I said, "Are you all right? Are you feeling okay?" She said, "I'm fine. Just, Pauline thought it would be better to keep Wednesdays quieter for a while. She said she'd explain." I said, "Did you want me not to come today?" There was a pause. She said, "Soleil, just let me talk to her. Come next week." I stood on her front porch with my hand still raised from the last knock. The sycamore at the corner was dropping its bark. The radio was audible through the door. I said, "Okay, Grandma. I'll call you Thursday." I went back to my car. The drive home was 17 minutes. I know because I noted the time when I left and the time when I arrived, something I had started doing almost automatically, the way you start documenting things when you sense, without being able to fully articulate it, that documentation will eventually matter. Pauline called me that evening. She said, in her smooth managed tone, that she was glad we'd had a chance to talk, and that she had taken the family's conversation seriously, and that they had collectively decided that my Wednesday visits, at their current frequency, were creating more stimulation than my grandmother's routine could comfortably accommodate. I said, "She told me to come next week." Pauline said, "We're asking for a full month first, to let her settle into a new rhythm. After that we can reassess." I said, "Who is we in this conversation?" She said, "The family. Dorothea and I, primarily, since Terence is in Portland." I said, "I'm family." She said, "Of course you are. But you're her granddaughter, Soleil, not her child. The decisions about her care structure are really for her children to make." I said, "Has she agreed to this?" Pauline said, "She's agreed to try a quieter month. She understands it's coming from a place of care." I said, "Did she specifically say she doesn't want me to visit?" Pauline said, she agreed to the plan. I noticed she hadn't answered my question. I noticed she was not going to answer my question. There was a pattern in this conversation that I recognized from somewhere, the way a structure gets described as agreed to when what actually happened was that it was presented until the resistance wore down. I said, "I'll give her a month." I called my grandmother every few days during that month. Each call was warm and clear. She was reading, she was gardening, she had an appointment with Miss Fontaine. She needed to reschedule because of a conflict with a dental cleaning. She was thinking about replanting the herb row. She did not sound like someone who needed a quieter routine. She sounded like herself. At the end of the month, I called Pauline. She said she thought another few weeks would be good. She said my grandmother had seemed more rested. She said the structure was working. She said maybe we try bi-weekly visits instead of weekly for a while, just to see. I said, "Pauline, I'm going to be direct. I think you're managing me, not managing her care." Pauline said, very evenly, "I understand why it feels that way, but I'm asking you to trust the family process here." I said, "I'll be in touch," and I ended the call. That same week I drove to my grandmother's house on a Wednesday afternoon and went through Harriet's gate. Harriet was in her backyard when I came through. She looked at me and said, "I wondered when you'd come around the back way." She handed me a cup of coffee from a mug she had just poured, as if she had been expecting me, which I later understood she probably had been. My grandmother had called her that morning to mention she was hoping I might stop by. I went in through my grandmother's back door. She was in the kitchen. She looked at me and said, "Finally," which was the warmest word I had heard in 6 weeks. We sat at the kitchen table with the window open and the radio on. I did not ask her about Pauline or the plan or the month of distance. I just sat with her. After a while she said, without preamble, I called Audra. I said, "Miss Fontaine?" She said, "I have an appointment next Thursday. There are some things I've been meaning to update for a while." I said, "Okay." She said, "You don't need to come with me. Harriet is going to drive." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the steady expression she has. The One that is not warm in a performed way, but is simply present, fully, and without reservation. She said, I know what I'm doing, Soleil. I did not ask what the update involved. I had learned, from years of knowing my grandmother, that she told you what she wanted you to know when she was ready, and that asking before she was ready was a way of making her feel managed, and she had spent the last 2 months being managed by people who believed they knew better than she did about her own life. I said, I know you do. We had tea. She showed me something in the garden. I left through the back gate. Harriet walked me out and said, very quietly, she's been waiting to do this for a while. I think your aunts pushed her into deciding. I said, do you know what it is? Harriet said, I know some of it. You'll find out at the courthouse. I said, the courthouse? She said, she wants to do it properly. In person. At the window. I drove home with the windows down. The air in the valley in early spring smells like cut grass and irrigation water and something mineral underneath. I thought about my grandmother at 17, working a cannery line, saving money for a winter coat. I thought about a woman who had run her own life for 55 adult years and did not need anyone to run it for her. During this same period, I became aware, through Bryce and through a conversation with my Uncle Terence, who is generally removed from family friction but occasionally surfaces when something is genuinely wrong, that Pauline and Dorothea had been having conversations about the house. Not about my grandmother's care, about the house specifically. Whether it was too large, whether the maintenance was sustainable, whether it made more sense to think about the value it represented and how that value might be better deployed as a resource for care expenses. Terence told me, in his flat and uninflected way, that Pauline had called him to discuss options and that he had told her he had no interest in discussing options for a house that was not his. I also learned, through a detail my grandmother mentioned in passing during one of our phone calls, that Pauline had stopped by twice in the previous 3 weeks with a real estate agent she described as a friend who was just doing a walkthrough informally. My grandmother said she had shown them the house because she was not impolite, and then she had told them she had no interest in listing, and then she had made them leave. She said the agent had left a card on the kitchen counter, and she had put it in the recycling bin. I wrote these things down in a notes document on my phone. Not with any specific plan, just because they were pieces of something, and pieces of something needed to be kept in order. The courthouse appointment happened on a Thursday. I knew it was happening. I did not know the specific time, and my grandmother had not asked me to be there, and I respected that. Harriet drove. I found out afterward from Harriet that they had arrived at 9:15 in the morning, that they had waited in the estate attorney's anteroom for about 20 minutes while Ms. Fontaine finished a prior appointment, and that when they went in, my grandmother had sat down across from Ms. Fontaine and said, I want to update the power of attorney, and I want to do the filing today. Ms. Fontaine had already been briefed. My grandmother had called her 2 weeks earlier and explained the situation, not dramatically, just factually, the way she explained most things. She had said that her daughters were beginning to make decisions about her affairs without her participation, that she wanted the legal record to reflect her actual wishes before anything was further rearranged, and that she wanted the document filed at the courthouse window where it would be a matter of public record, not just kept in a file. Ms. Fontaine had said, I can have the draft ready in a week. My grandmother had said, make it 10 days. I want to read it carefully. She read it carefully. She made 2 small corrections to the phrasing in one section. She signed it in Ms. Fontaine's office with Harriet and Ms. Fontaine's paralegal as witnesses. And then she and Ms. Fontaine walked 3 blocks to the county courthouse and filed it at the clerk's window. The clerk who handled the filing was a young man named, according to his badge, D. Alvarez. He reviewed the document, confirmed the notarization, stamped the filing date, and issued 2 certified copies, one for my grandmother, one for Ms. Fontaine's files. He put the original in the intake box for recording. My grandmother thanked him. He said, You're welcome, ma'am. Have a good morning. She and Harriet went to lunch afterward at a Mexican restaurant on the main street that my grandmother had been going to for 20 years. My grandmother had the chicken soup. Harriet had the enchiladas. My grandmother called me from the parking lot after. She said, It's done. I said, How do you feel? She said, Hungry. We just had lunch, but I think I want a tamale too. I said, then get a tamale. She said, I already did. The document named me as her agent for both medical and financial decisions. It superseded a prior document that had named Pauline as primary agent, a document from 9 years ago that had been drafted when my mother was still alive and when the family map looked different than it does now. My grandmother had not told Pauline it was being updated.
She was not required to.
The document was legally valid, properly filed, and now a matter of public record at the county clerk's office. How Pauline found out is its own small story. Certified copies of recorded documents in this county can be requested by any party who pays the filing fee and knows the grantor's name and approximate recording date. Miss Fontaine had advised my grandmother that Pauline might eventually think to check, though there was no obligation to inform her. My grandmother had said, with the precise dryness she reserves for things she finds mildly entertaining, I know exactly how she'll find out. What my grandmother knew, and what she had anticipated, was that Pauline had an annual habit of reviewing the publicly recorded documents connected to the family property, a habit she had developed after my grandfather died, and that she had never stopped. She checked the assessor's records every spring to confirm the property tax situation and the deed status. It was, in its way, an act of genuine care wrapped inside a behavior that had gradually become something else over the years. That spring review happened 6 weeks after the filing. Pauline called my grandmother on a Friday afternoon. I know this because my grandmother called me 40 minutes after Pauline's call and described it in the tone she uses for things that have gone exactly as she expected. She said Pauline had asked if there was something she needed to know about the power of attorney. My grandmother had said yes, she had updated it. Pauline had asked who the named agent was. My grandmother had told her. Pauline had said, Mom, I don't understand why you would do this without talking to us first. My grandmother had said, because it's my document, Pauline. Pauline had said, this affects the whole family. It affects how your care is coordinated. We've been working on that plan. My grandmother had said, I know what you've been working on. I also know about the walkthrough. There was, my grandmother told me, a considerable silence on Pauline's end. My grandmother had said, I am 78 years old. I own my home. My mind is clear. I have an attorney I have worked with for 30 years. And I have updated my paperwork to reflect what I actually want, which is my legal right. If you would like to continue being part of my life, I would be glad of that. But the paperwork is filed. Pauline had said, Mom. My grandmother had said, I'd like to go water my garden now. And she had ended the call. She told me this in the same tone she uses to describe what happened at the dentist. Factual, complete, not dwelling. She said, I think she needed to hear it from me directly. She's been listening to her own voice for too long. I said, Are you all right? She said, I'm 78. I've survived harder conversations than that. The formal public moment, the one with witnesses, the one I could describe with specificity, happened not at the courthouse but at the clerk's counter on the morning of the filing, when my grandmother stood at the window and handed the document to D. Alvarez and watched him stamp it. Harriet was standing beside her. Miss Fontaine was standing on her other side. 3 people watched the clerk receive the document, confirm its contents, and issue the certified copies. That was the room. That was the moment. There was no drama in it. My grandmother did not make a speech. She handed the document over, received the copies, said thank you, and walked out into the March morning with her retired librarian neighbor and her 30-year attorney, and went to have lunch. The drama, such as it was, came later, when the certified copy arrived in Pauline's hands, and she understood what it said. Let me tell you about the copy that went to Pauline. This was my grandmother's decision, made with Ms. Fontaine's guidance and over Ms. Fontaine's mild suggestion that it was not strictly necessary. My grandmother had said she wanted Pauline and Dorothea to receive official certified copies of the recorded document, delivered by mail from Ms. Fontaine's office, with a cover letter on legal letterhead. She had said she did not want them to find out through a database search or a second-hand account. She had said, if I'm going to change something, I should say so directly. Ms. Fontaine had drafted a cover letter that was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph noted that Celestine had executed and recorded a new durable power of attorney, effective immediately, naming her granddaughter Soleil as her agent for medical and financial decisions, and that this document superseded all prior instruments. The second paragraph noted that Ms. Fontaine remained available to answer questions and that the document was a matter of public record at the county clerk's office. The letters and certified copies went out by certified mail on a Monday. Pauline's envelope was signed for on Wednesday morning. Dorothea's on Thursday. I was at work on Wednesday when my phone rang with Pauline's number. I was in the middle of reviewing a grading plan for a residential project, and I let it go to voicemail. She called again 11 minutes later. I let that go too. I finished reviewing the grading plan and made a note about a drainage detail that needed revision, and then I listened to the voicemails. The first one. Soleil, it's Aunt Pauline. I need to talk to you. Please call me back. The second one. Soleil, I've received something from your grandmother's attorney, and I need to understand what's happened. This is not what we discussed as a family, and I need you to explain what you've been telling her. I noticed the framing of the second message. What you've been telling her. I sat with that for a moment. The fluorescent light in the corner of our office has a very faint flicker that most people don't notice, but that I notice because I am trained to notice things that are slightly off. I looked at it for a moment. Then I put my phone back in my pocket and went back to the drainage detail. I called Pauline that evening from my apartment. She answered immediately. She said, I don't understand this, Soleil. I don't understand why she would do this without talking to us, and I don't understand what you said to her to make this happen. I said, I didn't tell her to do anything, Pauline. She said, she changed a document that's been in place for 9 years. 9 years. She didn't mention it once. I said, she mentioned it to her attorney, and then she did it. Pauline said, this is going to create real problems for coordinating her care. We had a plan. I said, she knows about the walkthrough. Silence. A longer silence than the one my grandmother had described. I waited. Pauline said, that was exploratory. It was completely informal. I said, she put the agent's card in the recycling bin. Another silence. Pauline said, Soleil, I am trying to protect her. I have been trying to protect her. You're her granddaughter, and you visit on Wednesdays and you record stories with her, and that's lovely, but you are not equipped to manage the scope of what she might need over the next 5, 10 years. I said, she's not at the scope of needing to be managed right now. She gardens.
She drives.
She does the crossword in pen. Pauline said, that can change. I said, and when it does, I'm the named agent. We'll address it then. Pauline said, I want to speak with her attorney. I said, you can call Ms. Fontaine directly. Her number is on the letterhead. Pauline did call Ms. Fontaine. I know this because Ms. Fontaine called my grandmother to inform her of the call, as she was required to do given that my grandmother was her client. My grandmother told me that Ms. Fontaine had said, in her precise way, that she had spoken with Pauline, that she had confirmed the document was valid and properly executed, that she had confirmed my grandmother had acted of her own full volition and with complete understanding of the document's contents, and that she had informed Pauline there was nothing to contest. Pauline did not call me again for 3 weeks. Dorothea called me 4 days after Pauline. Her call was different in tone, less organized, more genuinely confused, with an undercurrent of something that I think was closer to hurt than anything else. She said she didn't understand why everything had happened the way it had. She said she had just been following Pauline's lead. She said she hadn't known about the real estate agent, which I believed. She said, I just want Grandma to be okay. I said, I know, so do I. She said, do you think she's angry at us? I said, I think she wanted to make a clear decision before anyone made one for her. Dorothea said, I never meant to. She stopped. Started again. The meetings were Pauline's idea. I went along. I said, I know. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular. It was the most honest conversation I had ever had with Dorothea, which is a strange thing to say about a conversation that contained almost no direct acknowledgement of anything that had happened. But she was not performing reasonableness the way Pauline performed it. She was just uncertain and a little sorry and willing to sit in that without dressing it up. The document was recorded. The certified copies were delivered. Ms. Fontaine's letter was on two people's kitchen tables. My grandmother was in her yellow house on the corner lot, watering her garden, with Harriet next door and her attorney's number in her phone, and a copy of the filed POA in a folder in the drawer beneath her microwave, which I found out because she told me, with some satisfaction, exactly where she had put it. I thought about that drawer. I thought about how a drawer is just a drawer until someone decides to put something important in it, and then it becomes a different kind of object entirely. My grandmother's affairs were in order. They had always been in order. It had just taken a certified copy stamped by a county clerk on a Thursday morning to make that visible to the people who had been acting as if they weren't. The weeks after the letters went out were quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet that had preceded them. Before the filing, the quiet had the quality of something being withheld, conversations that stopped when I entered, decisions made in rooms I hadn't been invited into, the particular flatness of a family operating on an unspoken consensus that excluded one of its members. After the filing, the quiet was different. It was the quiet of a situation that had been resolved, not suspended. My Wednesday visits resumed. My grandmother had never formally reinstated them. She had never formally canceled them from her own perspective, but there was a resumption of regularity that felt deliberate and settled. I came on Wednesdays at 2. The radio was on. The window was open when the weather allowed. She made tea, or I made it. We talked. I recorded some of it, with her knowledge, the way I always had. Pauline called my grandmother twice in the month after the letters. My grandmother described both calls to me in the same tone she uses for most things, not dwelling, just accurate. The first call had been Pauline attempting to revisit the power of attorney, suggesting that the family might benefit from a mediated conversation about it. My grandmother had said she was happy to talk with her daughters anytime and that there was nothing to mediate and that the document was filed. The second call had been shorter, more subdued, Pauline asking about a dental appointment, asking if my grandmother needed anything, asking about the garden. My grandmother had said the tomatoes were coming in early this year and the dental appointment had gone fine. She had said it warmly because she is not a person who holds things coldly, but she had not reopened any other subject and Pauline had not pushed. Dorothea texted me once during this period. She said, "I know things have been weird. I'm sorry for my part in it. I hope we can get back to normal eventually." I read it twice. I wrote back, "Thank you.
I think we can." And I meant it.
What Dorothea had done was follow someone else's lead in a direction she probably wouldn't have chosen on her own, and that is a real failure, but it is a human one, and it is different from what Pauline had done. I want to be precise about what I believed Pauline had done, because I think it matters to understand this accurately. I did not believe she had calculated everything coldly from the beginning. I believed she had started from a genuine, if condescending, concern about her mother's welfare, and that concern had shaded into something else as she found that managing things felt productive, that being the coordinator felt important, and that the value of the house, which she would have told herself she was only thinking about practically, had begun to exert its own quiet gravity on her thinking. People rarely do the thing they do for only one reason. Pauline's reasons were layered, and the one she kept at the front was real, and the ones further back were also real, and she probably couldn't have told you clearly where one ended and the next began. That is the most honest account I can give. My Uncle Terence called me once, about 6 weeks after the filing. He said, "Your grandmother sent me a copy of the document."
He paused.
She sent it with a note that said, "So you know."
He paused again.
"That sounds like her." I said it did. He said, "You've been going over there on Wednesdays?" I said yes. He said, "Good. Keep going." That was the entire conversation. It was exactly the right length. My grandmother took me to her attorney's office once, about 2 months after the filing, to do what she called the practical portion. This involved sitting with Ms. Fontaine and going through the document in detail so that I understood exactly what I was authorized to do and under what circumstances and according to what limits. Ms. Fontaine walked through each section with the precision of someone who has done this many times and understands that the difference between a crisis being handled well and handled badly is usually whether the agent understood the document before they needed to use it. I asked questions. She answered them. My grandmother sat beside me and occasionally added context. At the end, Ms. Fontaine said, "You're well prepared." My grandmother said, "I trained her." Ms. Fontaine smiled, which I had not seen her do before, and which seemed like a significant event. On the drive home, my grandmother said, "Your mother would have been good at this too." She said it simply, looking out the passenger window. I did not respond for a moment. Then I said, "I know." We drove the rest of the way in a silence that was not empty. The house is still hers. The garden is still hers. She drove herself to the pharmacy last week and to her hair appointment the week before that. She is reading a biography of a California labor organizer and has opinions about it. She is, as she has been for 78 years, managing her own life. The folder is in the drawer beneath the microwave. I know because I have been to the kitchen many times since all of this settled, and the drawer is still there, and she has told me it is in there, and she has told me I do not need to think about it until it's time. I have learned to trust her on this. My grandmother used to say, when I was young and impatient about things I couldn't control, that the people who move quietly tend to arrive first. She wasn't talking about herself when she said it. She was talking about something she'd observed, about the relationship between patience and outcome, about how much energy gets wasted in noise that could have been spent on movement. I did not understand it then. I understand it completely now. She had been watching her daughters for months before anyone knew she was watching. She had been thinking about the folder in the drawer. She had been moving, quietly, toward the things she needed to do, and when she did it, she arrived first, at the courthouse window, at the clerk's counter, at the moment when the stamp came down on the document, and the record was set straight. There was no drama in it, because there didn't need to be. The people who move quietly tend to arrive first. That's my story. A back gate, a drawer beneath a microwave, and a courthouse stamp on a Thursday morning. Here's what I've been sitting with since all of this settled. My grandmother didn't wait for me to fight for her. She didn't ask me to confront anyone or escalate anything or make the situation into something that needed to be rescued. She just made her decision, on her own timeline, using the tools she'd had access to for 30 years, with the neighbor she trusted and the attorney she'd worked with since my grandfather died. She moved quietly, and she arrived first. I wonder sometimes how many people have someone like that in their lives, someone who is being underestimated so thoroughly by the people around them that the underestimation has become the whole picture, and the person underneath it is simply waiting for the right moment to hand someone a certified copy. So here's my question for you. Have you ever watched someone you love be underestimated, and then watched them prove every single person wrong in the quietest possible way? What did that moment feel like? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.